She was the love of his life. Then she vanished without a trace. 10 years later, billionaire Damian Carter finds a beggar woman with 2 children on the cold streets of New York. And when she lifts her head, his world shatters. She's Eleanor, his lost love. And she's hiding a secret that will change everything. The city of New York was alive, but Damian Carter felt none of it. The sound of laughter spilling from expensive restaurants, the honking of impatient drivers, the chatter of well-dressed elites stepping out of limousines. It was all just noise to him. He adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit and checked his watch. 10:45 p.m. He had just left a charity gala. Another pretentious gathering of wealthy businessmen throwing money at causes they didn't truly care about. Damian had signed a check for $1 million without blinking, because honestly, what was $1 million to him? Numbers meant nothing. He could earn that back in a single trade on the stock market. But tonight, for some reason, something felt off. There was an emptiness in his chest, one that even success could not fill. He had everything: wealth, power, influence, yet there was always something missing, something he refused to name. As he stepped out of his black Rolls-Royce, the driver opened the door to his restaurant, an elite Michelin-starred establishment where only the wealthiest clients could afford a meal. That's when he heard it. A soft, sorrowful humming. Not just any hum, a lullaby. There was something so familiar about the melody that Damian stopped in his tracks. It was delicate yet filled with an ache so deep it cut through the noise of the city. His sharp gaze followed the sound, and that's when he saw them. Near the entrance of his restaurant, a frail woman sat curled up against the cold wall. Her arms were wrapped protectively around 2 small children, a boy and a girl, their tiny bodies pressed against her for warmth. She wasn't begging aggressively like others he had seen on the streets. Instead, she held herself with quiet dignity, as if she refused to ask for help despite having nothing. Damian took a step closer, his brows furrowing. Why did she look so familiar? The woman's face was thin, pale, her long, dark hair tangled and unkempt. Her coat, if it could even be called that, was threadbare, barely covering the 2 shivering children clinging to her. And yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the suffering written all over her, she was beautiful. Too beautiful. His heart clenched painfully. Something about her features stirred memories he had long buried. And then, as if feeling his gaze, the woman slowly lifted her head. The moment their eyes met, Damian's world shattered. His breath hitched. The noise around him disappeared. The city faded, because sitting there, in rags, on the cold pavement, was Elena Marshall, the woman he had once loved beyond reason, the woman he had planned to spend his life with, the woman who had disappeared from his world 10 years ago without a trace. His throat tightened as memories came crashing back, her laughter, her touch, her whispered promises under the stars. And then, her sudden disappearance. He had searched everywhere for her. He had gone mad trying to understand why she had left. But now she was here, sitting on the street, looking at him with fear in her eyes. Damian's hands curled into fists. What the hell had happened to her? To child with familiar eyes. Before he could speak, movement caught his eye. The little girl, 4, maybe 5 years old, lifted her sleepy face from Eleanor's lap. Damian felt his heart stop, because the child had his eyes. Deep blue, just like his. His stomach twisted in a way it never had before. His entire body went rigid. She was his, wasn't she? His blood ran cold. He turned back to Eleanor, his gaze sharp as steel. She's mine, isn't she? Eleanor's body stiffened. She said nothing, but her silence was all the answer he needed. But the skies finally gave in, and cold rain began to pour. Elena quickly pulled a thin blanket over her children, trying to shield them from the downpour. Damian felt a storm brewing inside him too, a mix of anger, betrayal, pain, and something deeper. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, demanding. "Tell me, what the hell happened?" She refused to meet his gaze. "Please, just walk away." His eyes flashed with fury. "You expect me to just leave after finding you like this?" Tears gathered in her lashes. "I never wanted you to see me like this." Like this? Like a beggar? Like a woman who had suffered far too much? His jaw tightened. "I searched for you for years. You vanished, and I never knew why." Eleanor bit her lip hard, as if trying to keep herself from breaking. "It doesn't matter anymore." "The hell it doesn't." Damian stepped closer, his voice dropping dangerously low. "You have my child." She flinched, wrapping her arms tighter around the girl. "Lily doesn't need your money, Damian." "This isn't about money," his voice cracked. "She's my daughter, and I deserve to know why you kept her from me." The little boy, the older one, looked up at him now. His eyes weren't like Damian's. He wasn't his. Damian's mind spun with questions. Who was the boy's father? What had happened to Eleanor? Why did she leave? But right now, only one thing mattered. He wasn't leaving without them. And the rain poured harder, and Elena's hands shook from the cold. Lily whimpered. Damian's heart twisted painfully at the sight. Without thinking, he shrugged off his designer coat, the one worth more than most people made in a year, and gently draped it over the little girl. Elena watched in shock, her lips trembling. "You don't have a choice," he said softly but firmly. "You're coming with me." Her eyes widened. "What?" He turned to his driver. "Take us home." Elena gasped. "Damian, no. You and the kids, you're coming with me." Tears slipped down her cheeks, mixing with the rain. She looked so fragile, so lost. "Why?" she whispered. Damian held her gaze, his voice raw with emotion. "Because I never stopped caring." Her lips parted in shock, and without another word he helped her and the children into the car. The door closed behind them, sealing their fates together once again. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. The luxury Rolls-Royce moved smoothly through the rain-slicked streets of New York, the rhythmic sound of droplets tapping against the windows. Inside there was silence, thick, suffocating and heavy with unspoken words. Eleanor sat stiffly in the farthest corner of the back seat, her body angled away from Damian, as if trying to put as much distance between them as possible. But there was no escaping him now. Her son, Jacob, 6 years old, clung to her side, his eyes darting between the rich leather seats and Damian's sharp, unreadable face. He had grown up knowing hunger, cold, and struggle. This world of luxury was foreign to him. Little Lily, wrapped in Damian's oversized coat, had already dozed off against Eleanor's shoulder, her small fingers still grasping the fabric, as if sensing something familiar in its scent. Damian, however, wasn't looking at the children. He was looking at her, at the woman who had once been his entire world. Now she was a ghost of that woman. The confident, ambitious girl he had loved was gone, replaced by someone tired, guarded, and painfully fragile. And he hated it. What had happened to her? What had stolen her fire? His hands clenched. He had thought about this moment for years. If he ever found her again, he had sworn he would demand answers. But now that she was here, he didn't know where to start. When the car finally pulled up to his penthouse mansion, Elena froze. The sheer grandeur of the place, the glittering chandeliers visible through the massive glass windows, the towering doors, the perfectly manicured gardens, was overwhelming. Jacob's small voice broke the silence. "Is this a castle?" Eleanor's throat tightened. To a child who had spent nights sleeping under bridges, in shelters on cold park benches, this must have felt like a dream. She turned to Damian, panic flickering in her eyes. "We can't stay here." Damian ignored her, stepping out of the car and opening the door for them. "Inside. Now." His tone left no room for argument. Eleanor wanted to protest, to run, but Lily whimpered in her arms, shivering from the cold. She had no choice. Holding her children close, she stepped into the house she never thought she'd enter again. The warmth of the penthouse wrapped around them like an unfamiliar embrace. Jacob stared at the glowing fireplace, his eyes wide with wonder. The staff, usually efficient and professional, looked startled to see a woman in rags and two children in their billionaire boss's home. Damian, ever the man of control, dismissed them all with a flick of his hand. Then, silence. Eleanor felt his gaze on her, burning into her skin. "You're going to tell me everything," Damian finally said, his voice low, controlled, but filled with barely contained emotion. Eleanor hugged Lily closer, her fingers digging into the fabric of Damian's coat, still wrapped around her daughter. "There's nothing to tell," Damian let out a bitter laugh. "Nothing?" "You vanish for 10 years, I find you on the streets with my child, and you say there's nothing to tell?" Elena flinched. "She's not just yours." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain. But he wasn't done. "And what about him?" He gestured toward Jacob. "Is he mine?" Elena shook her head, looking away. "No." Damian exhaled sharply. "Who then?" She hesitated. Then, softly, she whispered, "The man who ruined my life." His entire body went rigid. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat. She had never spoken about this before, not to anyone. But now, with Damian standing there, his intense blue eyes demanding the truth, she felt the weight of the years crushing down on her. "I never left because I wanted to, Damian," she whispered. "I was forced to." His expression darkened. "Forced?" Elena's voice trembled. "Your stepmother. She found out about us." Damian's face twisted in fury. His stepmother. That woman had always despised Elena, had always wanted him to marry into a family with power. "She came to me the night before we planned to leave together," Elena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She threatened me, Damian. She told me she'd destroy me, that she'd ruin your career, that she'd make sure I regretted ever loving you." His hands balled into fists. He could believe it. His stepmother had been ruthless, obsessed with keeping the Carter empire untouched by scandal. But what she said next made his blood turn ice cold. She wasn't alone. Damian's gaze snapped to her. "She had help," Eleanor murmured, her voice breaking. "The man I was working for at the time. I trusted him. I thought he was just my employer. But he—" Damian suddenly understood. "Elena," he said slowly, voice filled with quiet rage. "Did he hurt you?" Her lips trembled. She didn't answer. But she didn't have to, because the way Jacob clutched her hand protectively, the way she looked away, ashamed, told him everything. A deep, violent rage burned inside Damian. She had been hurt, abused, left alone, and all while he had been searching for her, blaming himself for her disappearance. He should have protected her. His chest ached. "Eleanor? Why didn't you tell me?" Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent, tortured. "Because I thought you had moved on." Damian's heart twisted painfully. Moved on? How could he have? He had spent years looking for her. He had drowned himself in work, empty relationships, meaningless wealth, all to forget a woman he never could. And now she was here. And she was broken. And he wanted nothing more than to fix what had been stolen from them. For a long moment they stood in silence. Then Lily stirred in Eleanor's arms, yawning softly. Damian watched as the little girl, his daughter, rubbed her sleepy eyes. He had missed so much, her first steps, her first words, her first laugh. His throat tightened. He knelt down slowly, so he wouldn't startle her. "Lily," he murmured. The child blinked at him, sleepy but curious. Damian hesitated. Then, with the gentleness of a man who had never known what it was like to be a father, he reached out and brushed her tiny curls from her face. She didn't pull away. His heart ached with something foreign, something terrifying. Love. Real, raw, unbreakable love. And in that moment, Damian knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never let them go again. And the mansion was silent except for the distant sound of raindrops tapping against the glass windows. Damian sat in his private study, a crystal tumbler of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. His fingers were pressed together, his jaw tight as he stared at nothing. His mind was racing. He had a daughter. For years he had believed Elena had abandoned him, that she had simply walked away. But now he knew the truth. She had been forced. She had been hurt. And worst of all, he had not been there to save her. Damian clenched his fists. The woman who had once been his world had been shattered beyond recognition. And he was burning with a need to fix it all, to make her safe again, whole again. But first, he needed to uncover every piece of the past. The sunlight streamed through the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow over the massive dining hall. Elena sat stiffly at the end of the long table, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her, Damian studied her with sharp intensity, his blue eyes unreadable. A lavish breakfast had been prepared, freshly baked croissants, golden waffles, exotic fruits, yet Eleanor barely touched the food. Jacob, however, ate hesitantly, his eyes darting to his mother as if seeking permission. Lily, still waking up, clung to the sleeve of Damian's crisp white shirt as she chewed on a strawberry. The sight of her so comfortable with him did something strange to Damian's heart. He glanced at Eleanor. She trusts me. Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked at her daughter. She doesn't know who you are. She will. A flicker of something passed through Eleanor's eyes. Fear, hesitation, and something deeper. Damian placed his silverware down carefully. We need to talk. Eleanor's fingers curled against her dress. Damian, you owe me the truth. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. Eleanor swallowed hard. I already told you. Your stepmother threatened me, and there was another man, my employer. I thought he was a good man. I trusted him. But he... Her voice broke for a second before she inhaled deeply. He made sure I could never return to you. A deep, dangerous rage flickered in Damian's gaze. Someone had hurt her. Someone had taken advantage of her trust, manipulated her, broken her. And he had no idea. His fingers curled around the edge of the table. What did he do, Elena? Her body tensed, her lips pressed together. It doesn't matter anymore. The hell it doesn't, Damian growled. He took everything from you, from me, from Lily. It matters. Eleanor trembled slightly, her grip tightening on her fork. Even if I told you, what would you do? Damian leaned in, his voice a quiet storm. I'd make sure he never hurts anyone again. Elena flinched. That's not who you are. He let out a sharp breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. You don't know who I am anymore, Elena. Her gaze met his, something unreadable swimming in her brown eyes. Pain, regret, longing. For a moment the past rushed back between them, memories of stolen kisses, whispered promises in the dark, a love that had once been unbreakable. But time had broken it. Or had it? Damian's voice softened. Tell me everything. And finally, Elena did. As she told him about how she had worked as an assistant for a wealthy investor, how at first he was kind to her, supportive, how the moment she found out she was pregnant, everything changed. Damian listened, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew I was carrying your child, Elena whispered, and he used it against me. He told me that if I tried to go back to you, he would ruin me. That he would make sure I lost everything, even my baby. Damian's entire body went rigid with fury. She swallowed. I had no choice but to stay, and for a while I convinced myself I could survive, that I could raise Lily quietly. But he... Her voice cracked. Damian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. Tell me his name. His voice was deadly quiet, vibrating with barely controlled rage. Elena's lips quivered as if saying the name out loud would give it power. Then, in a voice so soft, so shattered, she whispered, "Victor Langston." Damian's blood went cold. Langston, a name he knew well, a rival businessman, ruthless, a man who had tried to take over his company years ago, but Damian had crushed him in a brutal corporate battle. And now he knew why Langston had wanted to ruin him so badly. The bastard had stolen Elena from him. Damian's grip on the table tightened. His breathing was heavy, his rage barely containable. But then his gaze flickered to Lily and Jacob. The children. Their children. This wasn't just about revenge, this was about protecting them. And Damian Carter protected what was his. Elena, sensing the storm brewing inside him, shook her head. "Damian, let it go." He looked at her sharply. "You really think I can?" She blinked. "What do you want to do?" "I want to ruin him." His voice was ice cold. Eleanor gasped. "No." "Yes." His tone was unshakable. "He took you away from me. He threatened your life. He tried to steal my daughter. You think I can just let that go?" Eleanor's hands trembled. "Please, I don't want you to become the man I was running from." Damian exhaled heavily, raking a hand through his dark hair. He was angry, yes, furious. But more than that, he was hurt. "Do you even trust me, Elena?" he asked softly. Elena's lips parted, her eyes glistening with something he couldn't name. "Yes," she whispered. "I do. But I don't trust what your anger will do to you." His chest tightened. She still saw him. The man underneath the billionaire. The man who had once loved her with everything he had. Damian took a slow step toward her. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he murmured, his voice deep, warm, intimate. Her breath hitched. His hand lifted, gently brushing against her cheek. A touch so soft, so familiar, it made her eyes flutter closed. "Elena," he whispered, his voice a plea. For a moment, just a moment, she leaned into his touch. And Damian knew. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Damian Carter was a man who never acted on impulse, except when it came to Eleanor Marshall. The moment she had reappeared in his life, fragile but defiant, carrying his child and a past that had been stolen from them, something inside him shifted. He had spent 10 years believing she had abandoned him. Now he knew the truth, and he would burn the world down before letting her suffer again. The next morning, Elena woke up to silence. It was strange. For years, she had awakened to the sound of the streets, the shuffling of footsteps, the rustling of cardboard shelters, the distant murmur of voices. Even in the shelters, there had always been noise. But here, there was only stillness. Her body was stiff as she sat up in the enormous guest bedroom Damian had given her. The bed was too soft, the sheets too fresh, the air too warm. She wasn't used to comfort anymore. A soft sigh from beside her made her turn. Lily. Her daughter was curled up beside her, Damian's expensive silk shirt draped over her tiny frame as pajamas. Eleanor swallowed. Her little girl had never slept so peacefully before. And Damian, her father, had been the one to make that happen. Something inside her ached. She ran a hand over Lily's soft curls before stepping out of bed, determined to face the man who had turned her world upside down, all over again. As she found him in the dining hall sipping black coffee, the morning sun casting sharp angles over his chiseled face. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly somewhere else. When he sensed her presence, he didn't turn. "You barely ate last night," Elena frowned. "I wasn't hungry." "You need to take care of yourself." "Damian, I have a proposal." Her heart skipped a beat. Proposal. The word itself sent shivers through her. Once upon a time, she had imagined a different kind of proposal from him, one that had included a ring, vows, and promises of forever. But those dreams had died a long time ago. She squared her shoulders. "What kind of proposal?" Finally he turned, his blue eyes piercing into her very soul. "Marry me." Elena's breath caught. What? His voice was steady, absolute. "Marry me, Elena." She staggered back as if struck. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" He set his coffee down, rising to his full, imposing height. "You need security, a future, protection from Langston. And Lily," his voice broke slightly, "Lily deserves a father." Elena's chest tightened painfully. She shook her head. "You don't love me." Something flickered in his eyes, a brief, dangerous crack in his armor. "You don't know that," she swallowed. "You're just doing this out of guilt. Or responsibility." Damian took a step closer, his scent, a mixture of expensive cologne and something purely him, invading her senses. "Does it matter?" His voice was a low, intimate whisper now. "I'll take care of you, Elena, and our daughter, and Jacob." Her throat tightened. Jacob. Her son wasn't his, and yet he had never once treated him like an outsider. "Say yes," he murmured, his fingers brushing against her wrist, sending shivers through her skin. Eleanor felt her resolve wavering, but she had to be strong. She pulled away, shaking her head. "I can't." A storm passed through Damian's face. "Eleanor, I won't let you marry me just because you feel obligated." She forced the words out, even though they hurt like hell. She turned, ready to leave, but he caught her wrist, and in the span of a second, she was against the wall, his body so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. Damian's hand rested against the wall beside her, trapping her in place. His breath was warm against her temple, his voice dark and dangerous. "You think this is obligation?" he whispered. Eleanor's heart pounded. "This isn't about duty," he continued, "or guilt." His fingers traced the edge of her jaw, tilting her chin up just enough for their eyes to meet. "This is about you." Her breath hitched. "Don't push me away, Elena." His voice was raw, vulnerable. "Not again." Her chest ached. This wasn't just about security, this was Damian fighting for her, for them. And for the first time in years, she wanted to let him. Later that evening, Elena sat alone in the garden, staring at the ring Damian had given her. It was simple but breathtaking, a single elegant diamond that gleamed under the moonlight. Her hands trembled as she held it. "Mom?" She turned to find Jacob standing beside her, his small face serious. "Are we staying?" he asked quietly. Eleanor bit her lip. "Do you want to stay?" Jacob hesitated before nodding. "Lily likes it here," he admitted. "And I think he's a good man." Eleanor's eyes stung with unshed tears. Jacob had never trusted men easily. He had always been protective of her, wary of strangers. But he trusted Damian. And maybe, just maybe, she did too. The decision was made. She slipped the ring onto her finger, and deep in her heart she prayed she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. So that night, as she walked into Damian's office, she found him staring out the window, whiskey in hand, his expression troubled. She took a deep breath. "I'll do it." Damian turned sharply. "I'll marry you." A slow, unreadable expression crossed his face, something between relief, satisfaction, and something else. "Good," he murmured. Eleanor swallowed hard. She had expected him to shake her hand, to make this feel like a business deal. But instead, Damian closed the distance between them. His hand came up, cupping her cheek with aching tenderness. "Eleanor," he whispered, and before she could stop him, his lips were on hers. It was soft at first, tentative, searching. But when she didn't pull away, he deepened the kiss, pouring 10 years of longing into that single moment. Eleanor gasped against his mouth, her hands fisting in his shirt, and just like that, the past came rushing back. The love, the desire, the ache of everything they had lost. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, both shaken, Damian's forehead rested against hers. "This isn't just a deal," he murmured. And for the first time in years, Eleanor believed him. She stood in front of the mirror, dressed in a simple yet elegant ivory gown. It wasn't an extravagant designer dress, nor was it covered in jewels or lace. It was modest, beautiful, and perfect for a woman who had spent years with nothing. And yet, she felt like a fraud. Her reflection showed a woman trying to be strong, but inside she was terrified. This wasn't the kind of wedding she had once dreamed of. She wasn't marrying Damian out of love. Or was she? Her heart was a mess. Damian had kissed her that night, the kind of kiss that stole her breath and made her remember everything they used to be. But did that mean he loved her? Or was this still just a practical decision for him? She didn't know, and that uncertainty was killing her. A soft knock came on the door, breaking her thoughts. It was Jacob. He stepped inside, looking at her in awe. "Mom, you look beautiful." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "Do you think I'm making the right choice?" she whispered. Jacob's small hand wrapped around hers. "He's a good man," he said simply, "and I think he loves you, even if he doesn't say it." Her breath hitched. Did he? And if he did, why wouldn't he just say it? The wedding was small, intimate, held in the grand garden of Damian's estate. There were no hundreds of guests, no reporters, no billionaire business associates, just Damian, Elena, the children, and a few trusted people. And yet, as Eleanor walked down the aisle on her own, her heart was pounding harder than ever before. Damian stood at the altar in a sharp black suit, looking more devastatingly handsome than he had any right to. His blue eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. She barely heard the officiant's words, barely registered when Damian slid the cool metal ring onto her finger. But what she did feel, what she could never ignore, was the way his hands trembled slightly when he touched her, as if he was just as shaken by this as she was. "You may kiss the bride." Eleanor swallowed hard, staring up at him. For a split second, she thought he wouldn't do it. But then, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. Slowly, deeply, possessively. And Elena forgot, for just a moment, that this was supposed to be a marriage of convenience, because nothing about that kiss felt like a deal. The wedding night arrived with an unexpected tension hanging in the air. Eleanor stood in the massive master bedroom, staring at the unfamiliar bed. Damian was there too, standing by the window, his back to her, a drink in his hand. For a long moment neither of them spoke, until finally she did. "Why did you really marry me?" she whispered. He turned slowly, his gaze dark and unreadable. "You know why." Eleanor shook her head. "No, I don't. You say it's for Lily, for protection. But I think there's something more." Damian exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "You think I don't care about you?" Her chest tightened painfully. "Do you?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. "I searched for you for 10 years, Elena." Her breath hitched. "I never moved on," he admitted quietly. "Not really. No one ever came close." Tears burned in her eyes. "Then why didn't you say that before?" "Because you left me." His voice was raw, aching. "Because I spent 10 years hating you for leaving, and now I don't know how to stop." Eleanor sucked in a sharp breath. She had always assumed he had forgotten her, that he had moved on with some beautiful heiress, built a perfect life without her. But now she knew the truth. Damian had been suffering just as much as she had, and she had no idea what to do with that. So instead of saying anything, she walked toward him and placed a trembling hand against his chest. His heartbeat was fast, unsteady, just like hers. "Elena!" His voice was a plea. She tilted her chin up, and before she could lose her courage, she kissed him. This time it wasn't for show. It wasn't part of a contract. It was real. Damian growled low in his throat, pulling her closer, his hands running down her back as if he couldn't hold her tight enough. And in that moment, Eleanor knew. This was no longer about a deal. This was so much more. The days passed in a strange blur. Eleanor slowly began adjusting to life as Damian's wife, even if she wasn't sure what that truly meant. The children were happier, safer. But the peace didn't last. One evening, when Damian was away at a business meeting, a call came. Eleanor answered hesitantly. "Hello?" A cold, cruel chuckle came from the other end. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Her blood ran cold. Victor Langston. Her hands shook as she gripped the phone tighter. "Stay away from us." His voice dripped with amusement. "Us? Oh, Elena. You think because you married your billionaire lover, you're safe. Do you have any idea what I'm capable of?" Her heart pounded violently. "Leave us alone," she hissed. His voice turned deadly. "Or what? You'll run to Damian. Let's see how much of his fortune he's willing to lose when I start taking everything from him." The call ended abruptly. Elena's hands were trembling as she pulled the phone away. Her worst nightmare was coming true. She had dragged Damian into her hell, and she had no idea how to stop it. On that night, when Damian returned, he found Eleanor sitting on the bed, frozen, pale as a ghost. "Eleanor?" His brows furrowed as he approached. "What happened?" She couldn't speak, so she simply handed him the phone and let him hear the voicemail Victor had left. As the recording played, Damian's expression transformed. His hands tightened into fists. His eyes darkened with pure, lethal fury. When the message ended, he didn't say anything. He simply grabbed his phone and made a call. "Find Victor Langston. I want him ruined by sunrise." Eleanor's breath caught. "Damian." He turned to her, his blue eyes burning with something terrifyingly protective. "No one touches what's mine," he growled. And in that moment, Eleanor realized something. This wasn't just about revenge. This wasn't just about protecting her. This was about love. Because Damian Carter loved her. And now he would do anything to keep her safe. Even if it meant destroying a man who had once held her captive.